The chamber hummed with low murmurs, the flickering glow of holographic displays casting elongated shadows across the polished obsidian floor. Seated in a semicircle, representatives of the Galactic Council, some reptilian, others chitinous, some eerily humanoid, watched the lone figure standing at the center of the room. Ambassador Adrian Voss, Earth's sole diplomat in the Council, adjusted his cuffs and took a slow breath. His presence in the room felt almost insignificant amid the towering, grotesque, and regal beings around him, yet he stood without fear. "Humanity refuses to be strong-armed," he said, voice steady, almost bored. "We've come in good faith, and we expect the same." The track delegate, a creature with a skeletal exoskeleton and deep-set, gleaming red eyes, leaned forward, mandibles clicking in amusement. "Good faith," it echoed, its voice layered with amusement and condescension. "You overestimate your position, human. Your kind is amusing, but misguided. We allow you here out of curiosity, not necessity." Another delegate, an avian-like Saari, ruffled her iridescent feathers, tilting her head in a deliberate display of indifference. "You speak as if your people have power," she said smoothly. "But what are humans, truly? Loud. Reckless. A species that stumbles forward, mistaking brute survival for dominance." A ripple of laughter spread across the chamber. Voss exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. He let the moment stretch, let their arrogance swell, let them indulge in their own delusions. Then, he spoke, quiet but firm. "I wonder," he said, voice measured, "how many of you have seen a human war?" The laughter died almost instantly. There was a shift in the room, an almost imperceptible tightening of muscles, a shared glance between the elder races. Even the ones who had not faced humanity in battle knew of the stories, the wars fought in the outer systems, the brutal efficiency, the way human soldiers bled but never broke. The silence was brief. A tall, regal figure, one of the ruling Zalthari, lifted a three-clawed hand. His golden armor gleamed under the light. "Enough of this." His voice was a deep vibration, one that echoed in the bones. "The Council has deliberated. The humans have overstepped. We have tolerated your presence long enough, but Earth's influence has grown, problematic." Voss tilted his head, gaze cold. "Is that so?" The Zalthari nodded. "Your kind is dangerous. Unchecked. A disease that spreads without understanding its place. We have decided," he gestured subtly. The doors behind Voss locked with a deafening clang. The lights dimmed just slightly, shadows growing along the edges of the chamber. The guards stationed along the perimeter, massive warriors bred for nothing but combat, shifted forward. Their weapons pulsed with charged energy, their postures tense, hungry. Voss sighed. "I was hoping," he said softly, almost to himself, "that you'd be smarter than this." The Zalthari's mandibles flexed. "You stand alone. There is no escape. Do you truly think humanity will avenge a single diplomat?" Voss smiled, but there was no humor in it. He reached for the porcelain cup in front of him, lifted it to his lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea. Then he set it down with a soft clink. "I don't think," he said, voice like a blade slipping between ribs. "I know." A single heartbeat passed. Then, the first move was made. A towering Ralshith enforcer lunged, its six-clawed hand swiping forward, a motion meant to tear through flesh and bone in a single strike. Voss sidestepped effortlessly, pivoting just enough for the blow to miss him by millimeters. In the same fluid motion, his hand snapped up, seizing the enforcer's wrist, his grip vice-like, immovable. The alien's eyes widened in shock. It had fought hundreds of battles, crushed warriors beneath its strength, and yet, it could not move. Could not overpower this single, unarmed human. Voss twisted. There was a sharp, sickening pop. The enforcer screamed. Before the others could react, he moved. Not like a diplomat. Not like a soldier. Not even like a warrior. He moved like something else entirely, something older, something predatory. The second guard raised his rifle, too slow. Voss was already in front of him, his fingers pressing against a nerve cluster at the base of his skull. The alien convulsed, body locking up before crumpling bonelessly to the ground. The third charged from behind. Voss didn't turn. Didn't need to. He shifted his weight at the last second, grabbed the attacker's momentum, and sent it crashing into the chamber wall with bone-shattering force. The silence that followed was suffocating. The remaining guards hesitated now. The council, once smug and certain, looked on in dawning horror. Voss exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off tension. He turned, finally facing the rulers who had orchestrated this pathetic attempt on his life. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they were something else entirely. Cold. Calculated. Amused. You were saying something, he mused, dusting off his sleeve. Something about me standing alone? The Zalthari's composure faltered. He signaled frantically. More guards poured in, 20, 30, maybe more. This was no longer a mere execution, this was a containment effort. Voss smiled. Ah. You're learning. And then, he disappeared. One moment, he was standing. The next, he was among them. A shadow moving too fast to track. A force of nature that shredded through flesh, bone, armor with an almost elegant brutality. The sound of breaking bodies and strangled screams filled the chamber. Blood splattered against polished walls. The council watched, paralyzed, as the man they had dismissed as a mere bureaucrat dismantled their greatest warriors with nothing but his hands. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, silence. Voss stood alone in the center of the destruction, his suit barely rumpled, his gaze unbothered. He stepped over the broken remains of the last warrior, walking towards the council as if nothing had happened. The Zalthari, once so confident, now trembled. The track delegate, once smug, was shaking, his mandibles clicking in barely concealed terror. Voss stopped at the foot of the council's raised platform. He placed his hands on the polished surface, leaning forward slightly. Now, he said, voice quiet but carrying the weight of something far greater, something far older. Do I have your attention? Not a single counselor spoke. Some could not. Others dared not. Voss nodded, satisfied. He straightened his tie. Good, he said, turning on his heel. Then let's talk. And the chamber, once the heart of the most powerful governing body in the galaxy, was silent, save for the soft, measured sound of human footsteps fading into the darkness. The silence in the chamber was suffocating. Fear radiated from the counselors as Adrian Voss took slow, measured steps across the blood-slicked floor. The scent of ozone, burnt flesh, and desperation hung thick in the air. A few of the weaker-willed delegates had already collapsed, their bodies betraying them before they could flee. Others sat frozen, still processing what they had just witnessed. A human, one unarmed man, had torn through the finest warriors in the galaxy as if they were nothing. Voss wasn't breathing hard. His suit was barely disturbed. There was no rage in his eyes, no reckless thirst for blood. That terrified them more than anything. A monster they could understand. But this? This was something far worse. A trembling delegate, his pale skin glistening under the dim chamber lights, finally found his voice. You cannot expect to walk away from this. The council will not allow it. He meant for his voice to sound commanding, but the quiver betrayed him. Voss tilted his head, considering the alien like one might study an insect. You're under the impression that you still have a say in what happens next. His voice was casual, the way one might address a slight inconvenience. That's adorable. The Zalthari leader, his golden armor now stained with the blood of his own guards, forced himself to rise. His species was bred for war, for conquest. He had stared down armadas and crushed rebellions without hesitation. But now, as he looked into the eyes of the human diplomat, his limbs felt heavier than they ever had before. This will not stand. Humanity will pay for this. Voss smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made the room feel a few degrees colder. Will we? The Zalthari clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palms. We will retaliate. Voss nodded slowly, as if entertaining the idea. Retaliate, he echoed. That's an interesting choice of words. Tell me, what exactly do you think is going to happen if you try? The chamber remained deathly quiet. Voss took another step forward. Do you think humanity won't respond? That we'll take this as an isolated incident? You called this an execution. What do you think we call it? His voice remained level, but the weight behind it sent shivers down their spines. An act of war. A reptilian delegate let out a wheezing breath. The council, we did not all agree to this. Voss gave him a sidelong glance. Did you stop it? The alien looked away. Voss sighed, shaking his head. That's the problem with you lot. You believe power exists only in titles and ranks. That decisions made in grand halls determine the fate of the galaxy. That wars are fought with fleets and soldiers alone. He crouched down, grabbing the wrist of one of the slain guards, lifting the lifeless limb before letting it drop with a dull thud. You forget the real nature of power. The ones who hold it aren't the ones who sit on thrones. The Zalthari stiffened. You believe humanity holds such power? Voss exhaled, looking almost tired. You misunderstand. I don't believe it. I know it. The avian delegate, feathers ruffled and twitching in distress, shifted uneasily. If you think a single attack means we fear your kind. Voss cut her off with a chuckle. Not a pleasant one. Fear? No, fear would be reasonable. Fear keeps you alive. Fear stops you from making mistakes like this. He gestured to the bodies littering the chamber. The problem isn't fear. The problem is that you forgot who you were dealing with. The counselors exchanged glances. Some of them, the ones old enough to remember, had heard stories. Stories of what humanity had done in the past. How they had clawed their way into the stars, how they had faced extinction a dozen times over and refused to break. There had been conflicts, short ones. But the aftermath had always been the same. The ones who dared to challenge humanity were gone. Their civilizations erased, their planets silent graves. The younger counselors had dismissed these as exaggerations, myths built to bolster a fledgling race's fragile ego. Now, staring at the man before them, they realized the truth. Voss clasped his hands behind his back. You wanted to send a message. A warning. That humanity is to be kept in check. That we should know our place. He let the words hang, let them taste their own arrogance. Then, he leaned in slightly, voice dropping into something impossibly cold. You failed. A sudden movement, one of the remaining guards, desperate and foolish, lunged at him with a concealed blade. It never reached him. Voss turned, almost lazy in his motion, intercepting the arm mid-strike and twisting. There was a sharp, wet snap as the limb broke at an unnatural angle. The guard didn't even have time to scream before Voss spun him around and slammed his head against the council's grand table, the impact echoing in the chamber like a judge's gavel. The guard's body slid to the floor, motionless. Voss straightened his cuffs. You have one chance. One. His gaze swept across them, each and every delegate flinching under his scrutiny. You will issue a formal statement declaring that this assassination attempt was unauthorized. You will denounce it publicly, condemning the act against a recognized diplomatic envoy. And you will do so before I leave this room. The Zalthari's mandibles twitched. And if we refuse? Voss gave a small shrug. Then I go back to Earth. And I tell them exactly what happened here. And then, well. He tilted his head. Then we see just how many of your species survive what comes next. The chamber fell into panicked whispers. They knew what this meant. They had tried to cull humanity before, tried to limit their influence, to restrict them to their little blue planet. It had never worked. Not because of their technology. Not because of their numbers. But because humans never stopped. One war would turn into another. Then another. until the stars themselves burned out. The CRE delegate's voice trembled as she spoke. Humanity is a young species. We acted out of a desire for stability. Surely you understand. Voss smiled, but his eyes remained dead. Stability? He gestured to the bodies around him. This is stability? No one answered. Voss exhaled through his nose, stepping away from the table. Make your decision. Quickly. A moment of hesitation. Then, one by one, the counselors activated their holoterminals, issuing the necessary statements. Their voices, once filled with arrogance, were now subdued, careful. The official declaration would be transmitted across the galaxy within minutes. It was a disgraceful display, a humiliating reversal of their original intentions. Voss watched impassively. When it was done, he nodded, satisfied. He turned toward the exit, pausing at the threshold. One more thing. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the chamber with ease. You will never try this again. Because if you do, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes reflecting something ancient, something terrible. Next time, I won't be here to stop humanity from retaliating. And trust me, he let the implication sink in. You don't want to know what that looks like. The doors hissed open, and he stepped through, leaving behind a chamber full of trembling rulers, shattered illusions, and the undeniable, irreversible realization that humanity was not to be underestimated. The corridor stretched ahead, silent but not empty. Eyes watched from the walls, from the hidden cameras embedded in the council's architecture, from the trembling guards who dared not move. Adrian Voss walked with an unhurried pace, his shoes tapping against the polished floor in perfect rhythm, each step echoing in the unnerving quiet. His presence was no longer that of a diplomat but something far worse, an inevitability. He had left the counselors broken, their arrogance stripped away, their desperation barely concealed behind forced declarations of regret. But he knew it wasn't over. It was never over that easily. A voice crackled through the overhead intercom, hesitant, careful. Ambassador Voss, the council has requested that you remain in the secure sector until, he pressed a single button on his wrist device, cutting the feed. They were stalling. That much was obvious. The real question was whether they were still foolish enough to try something. He suspected they were. The door to the landing bay loomed ahead, flanked by two guards who held their weapons tightly, their knuckles white against the grips. He met their eyes as he approached, not stopping, not slowing. Neither of them moved to stop him. He saw it in them, the quiet resignation, the knowledge that whatever order they had been given, whatever protocol they were meant to enforce, it no longer mattered. Not after what they had seen. He walked past them without a word, stepping into the massive hangar where his shuttle awaited. The docking crew moved with calculated efficiency, their eyes avoiding his as they pretended this was just another departure, just another routine mission concluding peacefully. But peace had died in that chamber, along with the guards foolish enough to stand against him. He reached the base of the ramp, fingers brushing against the railing, and then he heard it, the sound of footsteps, hurried, precise. Not a panic. Not a mistake. An approach. He didn't turn immediately, instead allowing them the illusion of an advantage. Then he exhaled through his nose and spoke without looking. If you're here to try something, get it over with. The footsteps hesitated for only a fraction of a second before continuing. A diplomat, this time. Someone high enough to think they mattered, but not important enough to have been in the chamber when the blood was spilled. Ambassador Voss. The voice was steady, practiced. A moment of your time. Voss finally turned, his gaze locking onto the tall, slender figure before him. A CRE, sleek feathers shifting slightly in the artificial light, their sharp eyes assessing him the same way he was assessing them. He said nothing, waiting. The diplomat hesitated before continuing. The council has issued its formal statement as per your request. However, there are lingering concerns. Voss tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. Concerns. The diplomat pressed on. Your presence here has disrupted the balance of our governance. It is unprecedented. The fallout from today's events will have consequences. Voss exhaled, glancing back toward his ship as if debating whether this conversation was worth his time. You want reassurance. The diplomat's beak twitched, the equivalent of a frown. We need to know that humanity does not seek war. Voss let the silence stretch between them, letting the weight of his next words settle before he even spoke. You didn't care about that when you arranged the assassination. He stepped forward, just slightly, and the diplomat stiffened. You only care now because you failed. The Ciari met his gaze but did not refute the truth. Instead, they changed tactics. We underestimated you. Voss chuckled, the sound mirthless. You underestimated all of us. The diplomat's wings shifted uncomfortably. Then what happens now? Voss studied them, watching the way their muscles tensed, the way their breath came just a little quicker than before. He could answer in so many ways. He could tell them the truth, that this would be remembered, that the moment humanity was pushed too far, the war they feared would become their reality. Or he could lie, could let them believe their submission here had spared them from a worse fate. But neither option satisfied him. Instead, he chose something else. You should be asking, he said quietly, what happens next time? He turned, stepping onto the ramp, pausing only once before glancing back. Because there will be a next time. There always is. He left them standing there, their breath caught in their throat, their carefully rehearsed arguments crumbling under the weight of what they had seen. The shuttle doors sealed behind him with a hiss, the engines thrumming to life beneath his feet. He moved to the control panel, activating the pre-flight sequence as the comms lit up with another incoming transmission from the console tower. He didn't answer it. The ship lifted from the docking bay, thrusters firing, breaking away from the station's artificial gravity with smooth precision. The viewport displayed the vast expanse of space stretching before him, and in the distance, Earth's fleet, small, by galactic standards, but formidable nonetheless, waited just beyond the Council's immediate jurisdiction. They had never been far. Voss had made sure of that before he had ever stepped foot in that chamber. As the navigation system locked in coordinates, a secure channel flashed on his display. A direct line. He activated it with a single tap. Mission status, came the voice on the other end, clipped, professional. Voss leaned back, watching as the station grew smaller in the distance. Successful, he said simply. A brief pause. Resistance? He let the silence stretch before answering. Minimal. Another pause, then, understood. Awaiting your debrief upon arrival. The transmission cut, and he exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple before allowing his gaze to drift back toward the stars. There was a war coming. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next year. But it would come. The Council had played their hand. And when the time came, humanity would respond. They always did. Voss closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the ship settle over him. The universe had just learned a lesson today. The next time, they wouldn't have the luxury of forgetting. The silence inside the cockpit felt different now. Not empty, not hollow, just waiting. Adrian Voss leaned back in his seat, watching the distant glow of the Galactic Council station shrinking behind him. It was strange, how they had all looked at him back there, how the weight of his presence had settled on them like a sickness they couldn't shake. Fear was an emotion he had seen in many forms, on many faces, but today had been something else entirely. Today, they had seen a truth they could no longer deny. He exhaled, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engines as the ship cut through the void. His mission was complete, but the consequences of it had only just begun. The secure channel blinked again, but he ignored it. He knew what they wanted. Updates. Clarifications. Reassurances. None of them mattered. What had been set in motion back in that chamber wasn't something that could be contained with words. It wasn't something that could be smoothed over with negotiations or backdoor deals. This was something irreversible. The moment they had decided to kill him, they had sealed their fate. They had opened the door to a future they couldn't control, and now they were desperately trying to close it before it swallowed them whole. A soft chime echoed through the cabin as an encrypted message filtered through his systems. This one, he didn't ignore. He glanced at the screen, saw the sender, and smirked. The response was brief, no signature attached, just a simple phrase that carried more weight than any formal debrief. "You should have killed them all." He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. There was no doubt in his mind that this sentiment was shared among certain circles. He understood it, even agreed with it to a point. The Council had proven itself to be exactly what humanity had always suspected: arrogant, blind, and dangerous. Leaving them alive meant leaving loose ends, and loose ends had a way of unraveling at the worst possible moments. But Voss had done what he set out to do. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about proving humanity's strength through slaughter. That would have been too easy, too predictable. No, the real victory wasn't in how many he had killed, it was in how many he had left alive to remember. The survivors of that chamber would go back to their home worlds, haunted by the knowledge of what had transpired, burdened with the weight of understanding just how wrong they had been. Fear would spread faster than any fleet, faster than any declaration of war. And fear, Voss knew, was the most effective weapon of all. His ship's alert systems blinked once, indicating an incoming vessel. He wasn't surprised. He had expected this much. The Galactic Council wasn't going to let him leave so easily, no matter how terrified they were. He keyed in a few commands, his sensors highlighting the approaching ship, a sleek, angular design, unmistakably military. One of their Black Ops teams, no doubt. Sloppy. Predictable. He sighed, shaking his head. They never learned. The comms crackled to life, a distorted voice coming through. "Ambassador Voss. You are instructed to power down your engines and prepare for boarding. Failure to comply will be met with lethal force." He didn't respond immediately. He let the words sit, let them drift through the emptiness of space, as if they carried weight. But they didn't. He stretched his fingers, his expression unreadable as he leaned forward, activating his own comms. His voice was calm, measured, almost bored. "You must be new." A pause on the other end. Just a fraction of a second too long. Doubt creeping in. Voss let the silence stretch, let them feel the uncertainty before continuing. "Tell me, did they send you out here to clean up their mess, or are you just the poor bastards who pulled the short straw?" More silence. Then, a shift in tone. The voice returned, more rigid this time, more forceful. "This is your final warning. Power down your ship or what?" Voss interrupted, his voice still carrying that same effortless composure. "You'll shoot me? In neutral space? After what just happened?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't understand what's happening, do you?" Another pause. He could feel them hesitating now, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. They weren't prepared for this. They had been sent out here with orders, but orders meant nothing when the reality of the situation set in. They had expected a rogue diplomat, a man desperate to escape. They hadn't expected him to be waiting for them. He leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the control panel, his next words cutting through the static like a blade. "You have one chance to turn around. Right now. If you don't, you won't be making it back to whatever hole you crawled out of." A sharp intake of breath on the other end. They were weighing their options, running through their limited plays, trying to calculate whether this was a bluff. It wasn't. The ship held its position for several more seconds before, finally, the engines flared. A slow, deliberate retreat. Voss smirked. Smart. The war wasn't today. But it was coming. And when it did, those who had faced him here would remember what it felt like to stare into the abyss and be given the mercy of walking away. His ship's systems confirmed the clear path ahead, and with a flick of his fingers, he engaged the next sequence. The vessel hummed with power as it accelerated, leaving the remnants of the Council's failure in its wake. He leaned back once more, his gaze shifting to the vast expanse of stars ahead. The universe was changing. Today had been a warning, one they would never forget. But it wasn't the last. Not by a long shot. The darkness of space stretched infinitely before him, an endless expanse of silence and stars. Adrian Voss sat in the cockpit, his fingers idly tracing patterns against the cold metal of the console, his mind turning over the events of the past hours with the same clinical detachment he had always employed. The Galactic Council had made their choice. They had chosen arrogance over wisdom, violence over diplomacy. And they had failed. He had walked into their grand chamber as a diplomat, unarmed, alone, a man they believed to be nothing more than a pawn in a larger game. He had walked out something else entirely. A myth. A nightmare. A message written in blood. His ship's sensors flickered, the data scrolling across the screen in steady pulses. The council station was now little more than a shrinking speck in the distance, its leaders undoubtedly scrambling to find a way to contain the damage, to twist the narrative into something they could control. They would call it an unfortunate misunderstanding, a regrettable miscommunication, a moment of tension that had spiraled out of control. Lies, every word of it. The truth was much simpler. They had tried to kill him, and he had given them something far worse in return. Not death, but fear. The kind that would fester in their bones long after today, the kind that would whisper in their ears every time they dared to think of humanity as weak. The ship's comms flickered to life again, the encrypted frequency flashing across the screen. He recognized the signature immediately. He exhaled sharply before activating the channel, leaning back in his seat as a familiar voice filled the cockpit. "You made quite a mess back there." Voss smirked. "You say that like it's a bad thing." A pause, then a low chuckle. "Depends on who you ask." The voice belonged to Captain Elias Mercer, commander of the Black Horizon, one of humanity's most classified special operations vessels. If Mercer was calling, it meant Earth had been watching. Closely. Voss flexed his fingers, feeling the tension still coiled in his muscles. "What's the official stance?" Mercer sighed, the sound carrying across the void with the weight of something unspoken. "We're putting out the usual diplomatic firestorm. The Council's trying to save face, acting like this was a rogue faction operating without authorization. Convenient, isn't it?" Voss chuckled. "Convenient and cowardly." "Cowardly is all they know," Mercer agreed. "But it works in our favor. They'll bend over backwards to prove they're still committed to peace. For now." Voss knew better than to trust that sentiment. "And unofficially?" Mercer's voice lowered. "You did exactly what was needed. There's no undoing what they saw. No erasing it from history. They'll never sit across from a human diplomat again without wondering if they're just another ghost from the wars they thought they had forgotten." Voss's smirk faded. "You know what this means?" A pause. "Yeah." The war had been postponed, not prevented. The Council would tread carefully for now, licking their wounds, but eventually, the fear would turn to resentment. To anger. To something far worse. They would not forget, but neither would they forgive. They would prepare. And so would humanity. Mercer exhaled through the comms. "You need a place to lie low?" Voss considered it for a moment before shaking his head. "No point. If they're looking for me, they'll find me. Besides, it's better this way. Let them know I'm not hiding." Another chuckle, this one laced with something almost like admiration. "Cold as ever." "Efficient," Voss corrected. "They only understand power. I just spoke their language." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. They had both seen what happened to those who hesitated in this galaxy. There was no room for mercy. No room for misplaced idealism. There was only survival, and survival meant being the one thing the enemy feared most. Finally, Mercer spoke again. "You coming home?" Voss let his eyes drift back to the stars. Earth was waiting. The fleet was waiting. The storm was coming, and when it did, there would be no stopping it. But for now, there was still time. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, unshaken. "I'm coming home." The channel cut, and Voss keyed in the final sequence, his ship surging forward into the vast unknown. The galaxy had been warned. The Council had been humbled. And soon, when the time was right, humanity would remind them why they should have never made an enemy of the Baba Yaga.